When Italian prisoners arrived in Texas, they were terrified that the Americans' strange kindness was just a psychological trick to lower their defenses before execution. But when a guard tossed a soccer ball into the dust instead of a grenade, it didn't just start a game. It began a rivalry that would prove their shared humanity was stronger than any war. Texas, 1943. The heat hit them before reality did, a dry, suffocating blanket that smelled of baked earth and diesel fumes. When the train finally hissed to a halt in the middle of the Panhandle, 22-year-old Marco Rossini didn't look at the window. He looked at the floor, his knuckles white as he gripped his canvas rucksack. He was waiting for the shouting to start. He was waiting for the violent crack of rifle butts against the carriage doors signaling the beginning of the end. Marco was a boy from the narrow, shouting streets of Naples, but when the heavy steel doors slid open, there was no shouting. There was only a blinding white light and a silence so vast it felt heavy. He stepped out onto the wooden platform, blinking against the glare, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked for the firing squad. He looked for the brick wall. The officers in North Africa had promised them that Americans were gangsters, a nation of Al Capones who treated prisoners like cattle to be slaughtered. But there was no wall. In fact, there was nothing at all. Marco shielded his eyes and scanned the horizon. The land was flat, terrifyingly flat, stretching out in every direction until it vanished into a shimmering haze. There were no mountains to anchor the eye, no buildings to offer shelter, just an endless ocean of brown dust and scrub brush. The lack of physical barriers was more frightening than stone walls. It made him feel exposed, small, and incredibly vulnerable. The 50,000 Italians captured alongside him were being funneled into Camp Hereford, a sprawling city of barbed wire and wooden barracks that rose out of the nothingness like a mirage. As the prisoners were herded toward the gates, Marco watched the American guards. They were giants, most of them, sun-bleached men with rolled-up sleeves and wide-brimmed hats who leaned casually against their jeeps. They didn't look angry. They looked bored. One guard was chewing gum, a rhythmic, casual motion that terrified Marco more than a bayonet would have. A soldier who screams is a soldier who is afraid, but a soldier who chews gum while watching his enemy is a soldier who has total, absolute power. "Don't look at them," Marco whispered to the boy walking beside him, a terrified teenager from Sicily named Luca. "Keep your eyes down. If we look, they will think we are challenging them." The processing was efficient, almost mechanical. They were given numbers, assigned barracks, and handed blankets that smelled of mothballs. There were no beatings, no interrogations, just the slow, drawling voices of the translators telling them where to stand. To Marco, this efficiency was the most frightening part. It felt like the calm before a storm, the gentle handling of livestock before the butcher arrives. He sat on the edge of his cot that first evening, listening to the wind howl through the wire fences. He didn't sleep. He watched the door, waiting for the Americans to drop the act and show their true nature. The mid-afternoon sun hung directly overhead, bleaching the color out of the Texas landscape until the world looked like an overexposed photograph. Marco was scrubbing his shirt in a tin bucket of lukewarm water when a murmur rippled through the prisoners near the west fence. A solitary American guard was approaching the wire, walking with a strange, deliberate slowness. Under his arm, he carried a dark, round object. To the Italians, whose nerves were frayed to the breaking point, the silhouette looked terrifyingly like a man preparing to toss a bomb. Marco dropped his shirt, water splashing onto his boots. He watched as the guard stopped a few feet from the barbed wire, shifted his weight, and with a casual grunt of exertion, heaved the object high into the air. "Down!" Marco hissed, grabbing the shoulder of the man next to him and dragging him into the dirt. Around them, dozens of prisoners scrambled away from the fence line, covering their heads and curling into tight, defensive balls. They waited for the explosion. They waited for the shrapnel. But there was only a soft, dull thud, followed by the sound of something rolling across the dry, packed earth. 1 second passed. Then 5. Then 10. Slowly, Marco lifted his head, peering through the dust that was still settling. The object had come to a stop about 30 feet away from the barracks. It was not a bomb. It was a sphere of scuffed brown leather, its stitching fraying at the seams. It was a soccer ball. The absurdity of the image left the prisoners frozen. A soccer ball? Here, in the middle of the American desert? Marco stood up slowly, dusting off his knees. He looked from the ball to the guard. The American didn't have his rifle raised. He simply stood there with his hands on his hips, looking almost disappointed by their reaction. He raised one hand, pointed a finger at the ball, and then made a sweeping, kicking motion with his leg. "Play!" the guard called out, his voice carrying thinly across the distance. Marco felt a cold chill slide down his spine. Play? It had to be a trap. In the prisoner camps of Europe, guards sometimes amused themselves by forcing prisoners to perform, to dance or run, until they collapsed. Marco had heard stories of men told to run for freedom only to be shot in the back the moment they crossed an invisible line. Was this the American version? Were they supposed to run for the ball so the guards in the towers could use them for target practice? The other prisoners backed away. No one moved toward the ball. It sat there in the dust, an innocent relic of a normal life that felt a million miles away. The guard by the fence shook his head, seemingly confused by their paralysis, and eventually turned and walked away, leaving the ball sitting alone in the compound. Marco stared at it. The leather looked soft. He could almost imagine how it would feel against the instep of his boot. But he kept his feet planted firmly in the dirt. In a place where survival depended on invisibility, touching that ball felt like signing a contract with fate that he wasn't ready to accept. For an hour, the ball sat in the dust like an unanswered question. The heat shimmered off the ground, baking the leather until Marco imagined he could hear it cracking. To a man raised in the vertical crowded alleys of Naples, seeing a soccer ball left unattended was a violation of nature. It was a gravitational pull he could feel in his bones, an ache that sat deeper than his hunger. But every time he shifted his weight to stand, the fear held him down. Finally, the temptation became a physical pain. Marco stood up. "Marco!" "No!" Luca whispered from the dirt, grabbing Marco's pant leg. "Sit down! Do not provoke them!" Marco shook the hand off. He walked slowly toward the center of the yard, his heavy military boots crunching softly on the gravel. The silence in the camp was absolute. He could feel the eyes of 500 Italian prisoners boring into his back and the gaze of the American guards in the towers tracking his every step. His heart hammered against his ribs. He expected a shout. He expected the metallic slide of a bolt-action rifle. But there was only silence. He stopped 2 feet from the ball. Up close it looked weary, lopsided, and scuffed. It was beautiful. Marco took a breath, the dry Texas air filling his lungs, and without letting himself think about the consequences, he drew his leg back. Thwack! The sound was sharp and clean, a pistol crack of leather against leather that echoed off the wooden barracks. The ball sailed through the air, spinning perfectly, and slammed into the chain-link fence 40 feet away with a satisfying, metallic rattle. Marco froze. The entire yard froze. He waited for the siren. He waited for the punishment. But the only movement was the ball bouncing off the wire and rolling gently toward a group of prisoners sitting in the shade. One of them, a tall, sullen man named Giovanni, looked down at the object rolling toward his boots. Instinct moved faster than fear. Giovanni stood, trapped the ball with the inside of his foot, and tapped it back toward Marco. The spell broke. It didn't happen all at once, but slowly, like a fire catching in a damp wood. Marco passed it to Luca. Luca, terrified but grinning, kicked it to Giovanni. Within minutes, 10 men were on their feet, then 20. The circle widened. The fear that had suffocated them for days began to evaporate, replaced by the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the game. For the next 20 minutes, Camp Hereford ceased to exist. There were no fences, no guards, no war. There was only the geometry of the pass and the joy of movement. They were not prisoners of war. They were just young men playing keep-away in a dusty piazza. They shouted in Italian, calling for the ball, laughing when someone tripped, arguing over bad passes. The dust rose around them in a golden cloud, obscuring the guard towers. Marco received a high pass, chested it down, and volleyed it toward the barracks wall. It felt like waking up after a long, dark sleep. His legs remembered the weight. His ankles remembered the angle. It was muscle memory, ancient and undeniable. As the sun began to dip low, the game naturally slowed. The men stood panting, hands on knees. Up in the tower, the guard who had tossed the ball wasn't aiming his rifle. He was leaning on the railing, watching them with quiet interest. And though the distance was too great to be sure, Marco thought he saw the American nod. That night, the euphoria of the afternoon game evaporated the moment the sun slipped behind the horizon. Darkness has a way of reshaping memory, and in the cramped, humid air of the barracks, the silence was heavy. Sergeant Rossi sat on the edge of his bunk, his face hard. He watched Luca, who was smiling as he cleaned the dust from his boots. Suddenly, Rossi stood up and slapped the boot out of Luca's hand. The sound echoed through the room, killing the conversation instantly. "You are fools!" Rossi hissed, pointing a shaking finger at the men. "You think they gave you that ball because they like you? Because they want you to be happy?" Marco stepped between them, pushing Rossi back gently. "They let us play, Sergeant. They didn't shoot. They watched." "Exactly," Rossi snapped, shoving Marco's hand away. "They watched. They are studying us. In the Roman legions, we would feed the prisoners well before the end. It makes them docile. It gives them false hope." He grabbed Marco by the collar of his uniform, pulling him close. "They feed us beef. They give us leather balls. They are fattening the pig for the slaughter. Tomorrow or the next day, the trucks will come and they will take us somewhere where the ball does not bounce." A chill rippled through the room. Rossi's physical intensity struck a nerve. The younger boys stopped smiling. It made a terrible kind of sense. Why would the enemy treat them better than their own officers had? Suddenly, the heavy wooden door at the far end of the barracks groaned open. Every man froze. The light from the guard tower swept past the window, illuminating a silhouette standing in the doorway. Captain Miller stepped into the room, his boots thumping heavily on the floorboards. He was a broad-shouldered man with a face carved from granite. He didn't carry a rifle, only a riding crop tucked under his arm. The Italian scrambled to stand at attention. Miller walked slowly down the center aisle, his eyes scanning the faces of the men. He stopped in front of Marco. Marco held his breath, thinking of Rossi's warning. This is it. This is the trap. Miller looked Marco up and down, then gestured to his own feet. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice, and the interpreter hurried to translate. "You," Miller said. "You have a good foot. I saw you from the tower." Marco blinked. "Sir?" Miller leaned in slightly, a flicker of competitive fire lighting up his eyes. "My boys. They think they are athletes. They play gridiron football. They think they are fast." He paused. "I bet them $5 they couldn't beat you. Tomorrow morning, the yard, my guard against your team." He didn't wait for an answer. He simply turned on his heel and marched out into the night. The door clicked shut, leaving the Italian standing in stunned silence. Rossi sat back down on his bunk, his mouth slightly open. They weren't being sent to the firing squad. They were being challenged to a match. Dawn broke over the Texas Panhandle with a quiet violence, painting the sky in streaks of bruised purple. But this morning, the prisoners were led to a patch of scrubland where the guards had used white lime powder to mark out a crude, rectangular pitch. Marco stood at the edge of the field, his stomach twisting. Beside him, the Italian team looked like what they were, defeated soldiers. Their uniforms were loose, their boots scuffed. Across the center line stood the opposition, and the contrast was physically intimidating. The American team was made up of guards who seemed to have been carved from the landscape itself. They were farm boys from Nebraska and steel workers from Pennsylvania. They wore sleeveless undershirts that showed off sunburned arms thick with muscle, and they were punching each other on the shoulders with a force that would have knocked a smaller man down. "Look at them," Rossi whispered. "They are twice our size. Marco, look at the towers." Marco looked up. The machine gun nests were manned. The barrels were pointed down at the field. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just a game. If the Italians played too hard and humiliated the guards, would the machine guns open fire? But if they played to lose, would they be punished for cowardice? "Just play," Marco murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. "Keep the ball moving. Don't let them touch you." When the whistle blew, the cultural collision was immediate. The Italians moved with fluid, nervous grace, tapping the ball in triangles. The Americans played with chaotic, joyous aggression. They didn't understand the nuance of shielding the ball. To them, this was simply gridiron football played with the feet. Within the first minute, a massive guard named Johnson came barreling toward Luca. Luca tried to dribble past him, but Johnson didn't stop. He simply ran through the space where Luca was standing. The two collided with a sickening thud, and Luca went sprawling into the dirt. Marco froze. He saw Rossi clench his fists. This was the moment. He waited for the anger, for the fight that would give the guards an excuse to shoot. But Johnson didn't gloat. He stopped, looked down at Luca with genuine confusion, and extended a hand the size of a dinner plate. "Sorry, buddy," he boomed. "Thought you were gonna cut left." Marco watched as Luca took the hand and was hoisted back to his feet. The Americans weren't trying to hurt them, Marco realized with a jolt. They were just clumsy. They were playing with the enthusiasm of children in the bodies of giants. As the half wore on, the Italians danced around the lumbering guards, but they were exhausted. 10 minutes of running in the Texas heat left them gasping. Captain Miller watched from the sideline, his frown deepening. He saw the skill of the Italians, but he also saw their ribs heaving. The whistle blew for a break, and Miller walked onto the field. The silence that followed was instant and terrified. The Italians braced themselves. Miller walked straight up to Marco, looked at his worn-out boots, and then at his heaving chest. "You boys have heart," Miller grunted, "but you got no gas in the tank, and those boots are a disgrace." He turned to his supply sergeant and barked an order. "Get them fed, real rations, and find them some cleats. I can't beat a team that faints before halftime." The smell hit them first, a heavy, savory scent of sizzling fat that drifted through the wire mesh. It made the prisoners' empty stomachs cramp with sudden, violent hunger. When the Italians shuffled into the mess hall, they stopped dead. The serving line was staffed by the guards, and the trays were piled high with scrambled eggs, thick slabs of bacon, and jugs of whole milk. "Eat," Captain Miller ordered. Marco took a tray, his hands trembling. He sat down and shoveled a forkful of eggs into his mouth. The taste was overwhelming, salt, butter, richness, but the victory was short-lived. Within minutes, men were groaning, clutching their stomachs. Their bodies, accustomed to thin gruel and stale bread, rebelled against the sudden influx of rich American food. Marco felt a wave of nausea wash over him, sweating as he forced himself to keep the food down. It was a brutal reminder of how weak they truly were. But Miller didn't stop feeding them. Over the next week, their bodies adjusted, the hollows in their cheeks filled. The gray pallor of captivity was replaced by the flush of health. Then came the equipment. A jeep rolled up to the practice field, and Miller kicked a crate toward the center of the pitch. "Open it!" Marco pried the lid off. Inside lay a jumble of boots. They were old, mismatched, and stiff with age. Some were baseball cleats, others were football boots with improvised studs. Marco pulled out a pair, the leather cracked and hard. He sat in the dust, forcing his feet into them. They pinched his toes and rubbed his heels raw within minutes, but when he stood and dug his toe into the ground, there was grip, traction. The dynamic in the camp began to shift. The guards began to linger by the field. The big guard, Johnson, approached Marco one afternoon. He pointed to the ball, then to his own foot, miming a curving motion. "How?" he asked. "How do you make it turn?" Marco didn't speak English, and Johnson didn't speak Italian, but they spoke the geometry of the game. Marco demonstrated the angle of the instep. Johnson watched, nodding, his rifle leaning forgotten against a fence post. For an hour, the prisoner taught the guard, and the wire fence between them seemed to disappear. But as their confidence grew, so did the trouble. The captain's experiment had leaked to the town, and the locals were not happy about it. Sunday mornings in Camp Hereford were usually quiet, but this morning the air carried a low, mechanical rumble. Marco looked up from the field to see a cloud of dust rising from the access road. Cars and pickup trucks were pulling up to the perimeter fence, their chrome bumpers glinting in the harsh sun. Families climbed out, men in suits, women in Sunday dresses. They hadn't come to cheer. They had come to stare. News of the Fascist Ball Players had spread, and the townspeople pressed their faces against the chain-link wire with expressions of cold hostility. Many of them had sons fighting in Italy. To them, Marco and his team were not athletes. They were the monsters who had taken their boys. "Get 'em, Miller!" a voice shouted from the fence, sharp and angry. "Teach those kraut lovers a lesson!" "We aren't Germans!" Luca yelled back, his voice cracking. He stumbled away from the sideline, shrinking under the glare of the crowd. "They hate us, Marco. Look at them!" A rock clattered onto the field, thrown by a teenager near the fence. It skipped through the dust, stopping near Marco's boots. The American guards on the opposing team stiffened. The friendly banter of the practice sessions evaporated. They were performing for their neighbors now, and the pressure to dominate the prisoners was heavy. Johnson was strapping on his knee pads with aggressive force, refusing to meet Marco's eye. Marco felt the mood on the pitch darken. The guards looked bigger, meaner. The crowd wanted blood. If the Italians won, the town would riot. If they lost, they would be humiliated. "Listen to me," Marco said, grabbing Luca by the shoulder and shaking him. "Do not look at the fence. Today the field is the only world that matters." He pointed to the scuffed leather ball. "We cannot fight them with guns. But with this, we can show them we are men, not monsters. That is our weapon." Captain Miller walked to the center, a silver whistle around his neck. He looked at the angry crowd, then at the terrified Italians. He didn't smile. He blew the whistle, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the shouts. The game was on, and Marco realized that for the next 90 minutes they weren't playing for a score, they were playing for their survival. The whistle unleashed chaos. The Americans played like locomotives, charging in straight lines with physical intensity that bordered on combat. They fought for every inch of the dusty pitch as if storming a beachhead. The Italians, by contrast, were ghosts. They moved in triangles, weaving passes that left the guards chasing shadows. From the sidelines, the townspeople roared, but their cheers were ugly. Every time an American shoulder slammed into an Italian ribcage, the crowd erupted. They wanted to see the prisoners knocked down. They wanted punishment. 20 minutes in, the tension snapped. Marco intercepted a pass and sprinted toward the American goal. Closing in from his left was Johnson. In the heat of the game, Johnson forgot the lessons of finesse. Instinct took over. He lowered his shoulder and plowed into Marco like a freight train. The impact was sickening. Marco went flying, skidding violently across the hard-packed earth. He landed in a heap, gasping for air. The crowd exploded. "That's it! Crush him!" Marco scrambled to his knees, his fists clenching. His teammates rushed forward, shouting in Italian. The American guards stepped up, chests puffed out. It was a powder keg. One punch, and the machine guns in the towers would have a reason to fire. Marco looked up, waiting for Johnson to sneer. But Johnson wasn't sneering. He was kneeling. The giant American reached down, his face etched with concern. He grabbed Marco's forearm and hoisted him effortlessly to his feet. He patted Marco on the back, a solid, respectful thud. "Hell of a run, partner," Johnson said, loud enough for the front row to hear. "Almost had me." Marco stared at him, then grinned through the grit on his teeth. "Next time," he gasped, "I go faster." The crowd fell silent. The angry shouts died. They had come to see a fight between good and evil, but they were watching two young men playing a game. Johnson's gesture had popped the balloon of hate. The dehumanizing fog of war momentarily lifted, revealing something simpler: sportsmanship. By the second half, the sun turned the dust into a golden mist. The score was tied, 1-1. The crowd was no longer shouting insults. They were leaning against the wire, watching the stalemate. The invisible wall of prejudice was cracking under the weight of the effort on the field. The turning point came with 5 minutes left. The ball spilled loose near the center circle. Marco trapped it, turned, and saw Johnson closing in again. This time, Marco didn't try to outrun him. He remembered the geometry lesson. Marco dipped his shoulder, feinting right. Johnson bit on the fake, his momentum carrying him past. Marco looked up, saw the sliver of daylight, and struck the ball with the outside of his boot. It didn't fly straight, it arced beautifully, bending around the diving American keeper and nestling into the corner of the net. The whistle blew. The Italians had won. For a second there was total silence. Marco stood frozen, his chest heaving. Had he made a mistake? Had he humiliated them? He braced himself for the backlash. Then Johnson walked toward him. He didn't have a baton, he had a water canteen. He took a swig, wiped the rim, and handed it to Marco. "Good game," Johnson grunted. Marco took the canteen. He drank, the water tasting like life itself, and passed it to Luca. From the fence line, a lone rancher started to clap, then another, then a woman. They weren't cheering for the enemy. They were cheering for the game. The boundaries that defined their world had been permanently redrawn. 1945 arrived with the grinding gears of transport trucks. The war was over. The barbed wire gates were finally swinging open. Marco stood by the truck, his canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He looked older, his shoulders broader, filled out by American beef. The camp was dissolved. The strange, suspended reality they had lived in was fracturing back into history. "Leaving already?" Captain Miller approached. He wasn't wearing his helmet. In his hands he held the game ball, scuffed and worn smooth. He held it out. "Can't play without a ball," he said, his voice gruff. "Take it back to Naples. Teach your boys how to beat us properly next time." Marco took the ball. It felt heavy with the memory of sun and sweat. "Thank you, Captain," he said softly. "We will remember." Miller smiled, a rare crooked expression. "Yeah, we will too." When Marco stepped off the train in Naples, the city was a skeleton of rubble. The warmth of Texas seemed like a fever dream. But Marco had the ball. Years turned into decades. Marco grew old, his hair turning white. But every Sunday he would walk to the local park to watch his grandson play. One afternoon, as the sun set, Marco closed his eyes. He could still smell the sagebrush. He could feel the heavy thud of Johnson's hand on his back. They had arrived in Texas thinking it was a trap designed to break them, but as he watched the children play, he realized the truth. The camp hadn't been a cage for their humanity. It had been an incubator for it. The Americans hadn't trapped them, they had saved them. And sometimes, Marco thought as the final whistle blew, the only way to survive a war is to stop fighting it, even if just for 90 minutes. If this story of finding common ground on a dusty field moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe to uncover more lost moments of history. Sometimes, the greatest victories are the ones where nobody loses.